Hello, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com, here for another great DevOps webinar. Got a nice webinar lined up today, and I first want to thank our friends at TaskTop for sponsoring today's webinar. And the title of the webinar, as hopefully you can see in the slide, is Discovering Dark Debt in Your Culture. Before we get started, though, let me just briefly go over some of our GoToWebinar tips and tricks here to make this a more enjoyable webinar. First of all, we have set aside time for questions, and they will be near the conclusion of the webinar. If you folks can look at your GoToWebinar control panel, in most cases it's in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a GoToWebinar section marked questions. And if you hit the little caret or arrow, it'll expand. You can see that you could type your questions in there. If you could type in your questions in real time, you don't have to worry about forgetting them. You don't have to worry about asking them at the appropriate time. They will be queued in there. We have a record of it. And even if for some reason our guests don't have time to answer your question, we have it on, we have a record of it, and they can do so in writing after the fact. So please, if you have a question about anything in our presentation today, take the time in real time. Don't wait till later. Type it in, and you're queued and ready to go. There's another section of our GoToWebinar control panel, though, marked Chat. And under Chat, that's more for maybe you're having a technical issue. Maybe the slides aren't advancing. Maybe the video's hanging. Audio's a problem. If you could type into that chat window, we do have webinar engineers standing by who will do their best and try to help you so that you don't miss out. Just really quickly, questions make the webinar. So if you think of a question, there's no question that's dumb or stupid. Ask your questions, and we'll do our best to get you answers. One other quick point is we will be doing some polling today. And polling questions are another great way to make these webinars interactive. I think we have 3 or 4 polling questions. But again, they're only as good as yours. It takes about a minute. They're multiple choice. Just go in, click your answers. And it's interesting to see where the audience comes out on these great polling questions. So with that being said, let's move on to today's webinar. As I mentioned, it's sponsored by TaskTop, and we have 2 excellent guests to talk about discovering dark debt in your culture. If we could advance to the next slide, and I will introduce our guest. Our first guest is actually a friend of mine from the DevOps world now for 4 or 5 years. She is Mrs. Kanban, Kanban expert as well. She has a new book out. She's going to tell us all about it, I hope. And it's Dominika DeGrandis. Dominika, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alan. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, and our, excuse me, our second guest is from TaskTop, and it's John Rouser. Did I mispronounce that, John?
Rouser, yeah. Pretty close. Yeah.
I try. John, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
So, John, I gave the audience a little bit of Dominika's background, but why don't you tell us a little bit of your background?
Well, I'm the head of IT here at TaskTop, so I'm responsible for infrastructure, operations, and security in the IT world here. I'm very passionate about how those things impact the people and the culture of our organization.
Great. All right, before I hand things over to our esteemed panel, you've probably noticed that this is a video webinar today. We're lucky enough to have John and Dominika with good bandwidth, and hopefully it's working for you. I'll probably be turning my video off as we get going to enable greater bandwidth sharing all around. But we're here, and I hope this works for you. We'll be interested. We don't do a lot of these on video yet. And if anyone has comments, problems, compliments, if you could let us know either via email afterwards or in the chat, it would be great. With that being said, let's turn things over and get started.
Hey, thank you so much, Alan.
Yep.
Yeah, we thought it'd be fun to do. Video because when you can add visual aspects to whatever you're talking about, it's pretty helpful.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, thanks very much, Alan. It was a great introduction. So our goal today, what are we here to do? Well, we want to help you recognize symptoms of cultural debt and learn ways to manage it in your organization. Give you something to think about, maybe add a new dimension to your decisions when you're making them. So what is debt? It kind of has a negative connotation to it. You might be thinking about your credit card bills or your cable bills that you haven't paid yet. So yeah, it can come off as a little bit negative, but it's a fact of life. We have these things, we have our obligations, we have our duties to keep our lives in order. And it can be a good thing. It's how we build our lives in our organizations. It helps us move at a faster pace. It's a force multiplier. It allows us to achieve a higher velocity in our organizations. It'll let us hire more people, build new products. So it can be good to take on. It can help us grow and innovate.
I mean, it's certainly the reason I have a house now is because I was able to get long-term financing, and same thing with my first car. I wouldn't have been able to afford that with all that cash up front. And a lot of places you can, the interest on the debt is written off as an expense. So it's certainly a bad thing. Given the talk of this title, the first thing that I want to know is, what is dark debt?
So it's the debt that's hard to see. Dark debt is invisible for the most part. You don't see it until you're actually experiencing it. And so when it comes to culture, we want to be careful. It's the product of making decisions inside really complex systems. And when it does rear its maybe sometimes ugly head, it can generate complex system failures.
We were talking about how we defined it. John and I were kind of struggling, like how we find dark debt, and I almost came to the conclusion that it's pretty hard to define. It's like you can maybe detect it if you know what to look for, but it's just hard to see. But it's there, like a cancer. It's there, and like a cancer, cultural debt's complicated, and so we want to dive into that and talk about how to manage it. But first, let's just take the debt metaphor a bit farther.
Take a step back and talk about tech debt. So we're all familiar with tech debt. It's been around for 25 years. It's become a practice and a discipline for managing it. It's really a core competency of engineering management these days. And so the word was coined in the early 90s by Ward Cunningham. He needed to justify the rework, the refactoring of existing code, of finished features, in order to fix problems that they were going to stumble across later. So he used the debt metaphor to justify it to the business, and said that if we don't pay this debt down, we're going to keep stumbling over the interest payments. The interest payments are going to keep building up and eventually could bring the company down. Yeah,
I like his quote. He's saying, like, the entire engineering organization could be brought to a standstill under the debt load of an unconsolidated implementation. And that got people's, people on the business side able to understand it because of the debt metaphor.
It turned some heads. So, cultural debt, similarly, we can find ourselves making decisions, maybe even compromises that borrow against the culture of our company. So we never deliberately want to hurt the culture of our company, but we can find ourselves in situations where the culture is getting hurt as a side effect of our actions. If we don't pay that down, we're going to find ourselves in an equally crippling situation.
Yeah, totally agree.
And so why does it matter? Why do we need to think about this stuff? Why do we need to start maybe even having a practice around managing it? Well, the effects are cascading. Every decision that creates cultural debt adds to the organization's interest payments. It adds to the complexity of the organization, and it builds up. And secondly, it impacts the whole system. So decisions that create cultural debt cross team boundaries. They go wide-ranging in the organization. Local decisions made by a single team can set up the entire organization for cultural debt.
I want to make this point about misalignment. I don't think we can talk about misalignment enough. Cultural debt builds up when the misalignment festers longer and longer. When people aren't on the same page, they walk away from meetings that initially were intended to get everybody on the same page, but they walk away unconvinced of some of the decisions that were made. And because they're unconvinced, you know, they do things half-heartedly, and this passive resistance settles in, and that accumulates over time. It's a problem. So, you know, if the cause of passive resistance is ignored, then cultural debt's going to continue to grow, kind of like the reverse of compound interest. So let's just dive into some of these attributes here. Oh, no, wait, we got a poll.
Poll time.
Poll time.
Guys, we've never done polls with video. Let's keep our fingers crossed, and you know, we are feedback loop and DevOpsing it. So, to what extent do you discuss debt in your organization, or is it, you know, pardon the pun, swept under the rug? Select only one of the following, please. We discuss debt and have a plan for managing it. We discuss it but don't really have a process or plan for managing it. Or we rarely or never discuss debt. Sounds like a family conversation almost, doesn't it? Anyway, if you could answer here, we'd appreciate it. And we are going, come on, we've got only about 2/3 of you who voted. There's got to be more out there. We'll close voting off, though, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what the survey says.
And we're back.
Nope, we're not back yet. So,
okay.
Unfortunately, this was probably what I expected. I'm not sure about you guys, but almost half of our respondents, 48%, rarely discuss it, rarely or never discuss debt. And then another 40%, so 38%, they'll discuss it occasionally, but they don't really have a process for managing it. And you know, just 14% discuss it and have a plan for managing.
Hey,
John, what do you think?
First thing I want is can somebody take a snapshot of that screen so we can collect that data? That's awesome.
Right.
Yeah. It's in. We've got it.
Okay. Okay. Good. You know, it's kind of sad to see those numbers, but I'm not surprised. This is the culture debt's sort of like the taboo topic. It's not the easiest thing to talk about.
And we're not yet, exactly, we're not comfortable talking about it yet. It's not a thing like technical debt is. So we've maybe got to make some changes and get it out there. So,
yeah. So let's talk about it.
Hey guys, before we talk about it, just real quickly, I see some good questions already popping into the question queue, and thank you very much. But if you have more folks, now's the time to get them in there so we can get to them at the right time. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, when we talk about art culture, we need to discuss these fundamental attributes because it drives people's perceptions and experiences in the organization. And these are the things that organizations borrow against. Each one is something that, a decision that gets made can negatively impact the organization's culture. So we're going to touch on some of these briefly. Culture comes in from every part of the organization, but let's start with leadership, because leaders have to figure all this stuff out, and they have to get aligned on it themselves. If they don't have, there's no mutual agreement on their purpose, why they exist. It just sets the tone from the get-go. So leaders are busy figuring out basically all this stuff, what we do, why we do it, who's going to do what, how we're going to succeed. But I could talk about leadership all day, but I want to look specifically at priorities, because if priorities aren't really clear, the cascading effects on the culture on a daily basis is severe. Everything, what I mean in particular is everything can't be a priority one. And we hear that a lot. And when people are confused about what to do today because everything's at priority one, then we end up working on too many things and they end up competing with each other. So ignoring the challenge that leaders have with prioritization is going to result in people taking on more work than they have capacity to do. You know, it's just, I don't think the topic can be discussed enough. And speaking of communication.
So communication in knowledge organizations where we're building software, we're technical organizations, communication is, it's our lifeblood. We need it, we crave it, can't get enough of it, really. And you know, here's the thing about information. It's useless if it's not shared. If it's not collective knowledge, then it's not good enough. So we need to get people in our organizations knowing that it's safe to communicate. And this is about building trust. It's about allowing people to be vulnerable and take on risks. It's giving them the ability to engage in healthy conflicts. I'm borrowing that from the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Mm-hmm. So you know, those kind of attitudes and values can foster openness and the ability to discuss issues as they come up. You can imagine situations where teams are cut off from each other. They're disconnected from each other. They're working in silos. They're not sharing information. There's no collective knowledge. There's only localized knowledge and locally optimized decisions. That's what we want to avoid. We want to connect the organization, allow everybody to have the freedom to communicate and feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah, safety. Safety is such a huge issue, and I think it's why we see this whole blameless postmortem gaining momentum and steam at organizations. The example I think of is when you go to the all-hands meeting and executive leadership is up there telling everyone about the strategy, but it's a one-way conversation. You know, rarely do people feel comfortable in a room of 100 or more people to ask that question. So, you know, when, you know, they're speaking and they say, okay, anybody got any questions? And it's silent. That's, you know, I think that's a signal like there's maybe some misalignment people don't understand. And that's why a lot of orgs are trying to deal with that by making their work visible.
That's right.
So what happens if we don't come to terms with cultural debt with respect to visibility? Well, the point is it's hard to manage invisible work. Invisible work gets forgotten about. It doesn't show up in the metrics, and managers can't help people if they're blindsided by it. So if we ignore the fact that there's invisible work, then there's no evidence of what consumed the team's time. You know, with no data, there's no good way to forecast what's needed, and people continue to get overloaded to 100% capacity utilization. Talk about culture hit. You know, we don't let our servers get to 100% capacity utilization, but yet we tend to let our people. And it has a major impact on job satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of job satisfaction, so here we're talking about happiness and the ability to retain your employees, get good Glassdoor scores. Just kidding. So the classic example of cultural debt here is asking people to rush a product out the door early. You're actually asking them to compromise on their values. So you're creating the tech debt. You know, we understand that, but you're also creating this cultural debt where people know they're not doing their best job. You're asking them not to do their best job, and it's also reflecting on their reputation in the organization. Maybe the sales team or the pre-sales team doesn't have the features they need, or the features aren't working. It reflects really badly on the people who built them, even though they were asked to do so. They were asked to build them like that. So there can be a persistent negative impact on their reputation. People don't feel like their contributions have the right value, and they don't feel enabled to obtain that value.
Good point. I always hear that people leave their job because of their manager or some disconnect with their manager, but it seems to, I don't know, the whole cultural aspect of people being unhappy with their work is, I mean, I left a job because of that. It was a fear-driven organization, and even though my boss was okay, you know, their boss had a lot of you know, fear-driven management that I wasn't really happy about, and I ended up leaving. And so burnout and attrition, big problem with lack of job satisfaction.
And that fear-based leadership, it makes it really hard to learn, doesn't it?
Yep. So if there's no tolerance for learning or experimentation or failure, all the things we hear that good cultures want to replicate, there's no opportunity to learn, and we just slide into mediocrity.
Yeah, it needs to be, people need to be enabled to take risks. That's how we learn. Not obsessing about metrics or efficiencies, giving people the ability to experiment, test, and maybe testing that's not tied to success or failure. It's tied to learning outcomes.
Yeah, and we say that all the time. It's not easy though. We just want to recognize that that's not easy. And so we're going to ask for your input here with another poll.
Another poll. Here we go.
Here we go on the poll, guys. Are we ready? So which of these ingredients of culture influences your decisions? And again, I think it's just select one of the following: leadership, philosophy and values, communication, visibility of information flow, job satisfaction, learning climate. And again, only a few of you have voted. Come on, folks. Get involved.
Get them in there.
There we go. And we'll close this off in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Voting closed. Survey settled. All right, so we got a little more diversity here.
Oh, look at that. Visibility of information flow.
Nice.
1/3 of respondents cited that.
Visibility is so key, so important.
What about learning climate being so low, though, guys? What do you think about that?
I don't know. My first thought is that people on the call have leadership that understands the need for a good learning climate, that they're in training, they have time to take classes and do cross-training. You know, maybe the other thing, you know, maybe the learning climate isn't great, but the other items are much more of an issue.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, I will just quickly and then turn it back to you guys. Surprise leadership and then communication were not 1 and 2. I would have picked that because I think a lot of times with culture and that type of thing, leadership is so important. And it was 27%, but anyway.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's interesting. All right. So this next section is going to be about what we call cultural debt catalysts. And these are the things that deserve some consideration from you because, you know, they can easily increase your debt if we don't pay attention to these. When you get wind of these upcoming things, pay attention, right? Because here's where you might be contributing or adding on to cultural debt. And so first step is back to priorities. Competing and conflicting priorities result in all kinds of bad stuff. Stale work, right? That's work that just sits on hold, like in the bottom of this board here, and that horizontal swim lane that says work that is on hold because they're working on all these other things. With that stale work, it means that work takes longer to do, so your cycle time increases, your throughput goes down, your quality goes down. And you can see that if you're capturing the right kind of metrics, and it's why collecting the right kind of metrics is so important. When you can see the delay and the waste from what I call zombie projects and blocked work, pay attention to the energy in the culture. A zombie project, actually that term came from Don Reinertson. That's a project that it doesn't get the love it needs. It doesn't get the budget, it doesn't get the resources, it doesn't get the head count, but nobody wants to kill it. But it's just sitting there and it consumes people's energy. And so the question I have for you folks is kind of an exercise, a takeaway is, how do you prioritize? That's really a key thing, is explicitly figuring out what the prioritization policy is. You know, are conflicting priorities an issue for you? How do you prioritize? If it's all from the highest paid person's prioritization, the hippo prioritization, then we can be at the mercy of their cognitive bias. Sometimes we're wrong when we're really confident. So keep that in mind.
I'll tell you something, Dominica, that everybody who puts a ticket in my help desk thinks that it's priority number one. So
yeah, if everything's a priority one, nothing is a priority one. But culture is mutable, and with new leadership or a different perspective on leadership, an environment with one kind of culture can change into another. Sometimes that's a massive, big change. This is our J-curve change here. Massive, big changes. If you're doing an agile transformation, especially if it's like difficult to execute, can bring about resistance, and that's what this picture is trying to show here. The y-axis is your level of performance. The x-axis is time. And introducing a great big change that is usually met with resistance, and so performance tanks. Why? Because you have to train people, you have to use new tools, maybe have to hire new people, maybe you have to sunset some tools. And eventually, if that trend keeps going, you fall into chaos. If the performance sinks low enough, somebody ends up getting fired, and it can take a long time before you get back up to integrating your new good practices into your system.
Yeah, you mentioned tools there.
Yeah.
We see that a lot here, where people here at TaskTop, where people are, our customers are perhaps bringing on new tools to accommodate specific needs for a team. Maybe it's sales and they're bringing on Salesforce, or IT team is bringing on ServiceNow, engineering is using Jira, and this best of breed approach, giving the teams the tools they need to perform their complex jobs, complex tasks. It actually creates divisions in the organization. It cuts people off from information, cuts people off from processes. It reduces visibility in the work that's being performed. Just paying down the interest on the debt of bringing in those new tools, the cultural debt, it means emails, it means meetings, it maybe means new communication tools like Slack, regular cadence meetings, and that's just to get the visibility and the coordination that you've lost.
Yeah, but I know we're not saying here don't bring on new tools. We know that change is needed. Yeah,
absolutely.
We just want to make you aware of it, that big change can bring on resistance and fear and make people uncomfortable, and it impacts culture. Just a side comment about change, though, this quote from Professor Brian Cox about why change is inevitable, and that's because second law of thermodynamics, everything is always moving from order to disorder. And if we're not actively changing, then it's not that things are staying the same. We're actually falling behind.